Okay, usual thing. If either of you, if we get interrupted or if you start answering and you lose your train of thought or anything like that, don't worry at all. It's not live radio, so I can sort that out in the edit. And um, other than that, I think we're probably good to go. So I will just go quiet for a few seconds, and then I'll jump in with the intro. Welcome to We Need to Talk About Farming, a new spin off series from myself, Will Evans, and the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. There's a lot of noise in farming right now, and for many, the future feels uncertain. This series is about having better conversations about the biggest issues facing agriculture. In each episode, we'll take on a topic that's making headlines and dividing WhatsApp groups and social media. We'll go beyond the buzzwords, cut through the cliches, and work out what really matters. In this episode, we are talking about cheap food. Now, Britain has some of the cheapest food in the world, but while farmers are being squeezed, too many people can't afford a healthy diet. How can growing food become more profitable whilst ensuring everyone can eat well? Well, I'm joined by Emily Norton and Professor Tim Jackson. Emily is a Norfolk farmer, Nuffield scholar, and rural policy advisor. Originally qualified as a lawyer, she's worked for an MEP in Brussels, written a long standing column for Farmers Weekly, chaired the Oxford Farming Conference, and has become a leading expert in food and farming policy. She's also recently been appointed chair of the AHDB. Tim is an ecological economist. I'm going to start that again. I knew I'd butcher that. Tim is an. Tim, when I read it, I thought I'll butcher that. Start that again. Tim is an ecological economist. Oh my God.
It's my least favorite
Econ,
word.
econ,
I know.
economist.
Economist. Yeah,
Economist.
economist.
Economist. Economist. Tim is an ecological economist and director of the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity at the University of Surrey. He's written several major books, including his latest, The Care Economy, published this spring. He's also a commissioner for the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission and an award-winning radio dramatist. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
You're really welcome.
Straight in at the deep end with the first question. We often hear from farmers and campaigners that food is too cheap. Lots of, I guess, farming unions. Jeremy Clarkson has said this, and lots of the farming social media influencers. But what's that mean? What does it mean when farmers say food is too cheap? Emily, to you first.
Yeah, okay, interesting question. When farmers say that it's too cheap, because there are lots of perspectives on this, and I think that's part of the issue. There aren't many consumers that are saying that food is too cheap, right? So, what do farmers mean when they say this? I think, technically speaking, we're really thinking about this changed risk profile that's going on right now, and the cost of growing and producing food in this country from farmers' perspective needs to be worthwhile. Otherwise, why would you bother taking the risk and investing all of that money in doing something which otherwise isn't, certain to reward you for your time and labour in doing so?
I guess speaking as a farmer myself, I guess sometimes it can just be a bit, you can get a bit disillusioned, can't you? Because you know full well the cost of producing this food. And then, you go into a supermarket and you see milk or bread, you can't believe how cheap it can be for sale. It takes a bit of getting your head around as a farmer, doesn't it? Tim, how cheap is food in Britain compared to other countries? Because it's something that's trotted out a lot, isn't it? That Britain has really cheap food. Has that become cheaper over time? Has it always been the case? Why is this?
I think it's really important to nuance the conversation a little bit with two kind of meanings of what cheap might be. And the first is, is it cheap for, let's say, the poorest households in the country? And the poorest households in the country spend less than. Sorry, I'm just going to have to start that again. I was exercising before we started, so my watch is talking to me.
Don't worry.
Um, yeah, I think it's. Sorry, I've been totally thrown off course
Do you want me to
by
ask the
that.
question? Do you want me to ask the
Yeah,
question?
ask the question again, just in case you need to use it again,
Yeah,
and I can go straight into it.
no problem. Tim, how cheap is food in Britain compared to other countries? We hear this line kind of trotted out quite a lot about how cheap food is in the UK. Is it really cheap, or has it become cheaper over time? Why is this?
I think it's really important to sort of nuance that question and the conversation as a whole with what exactly do we mean by cheap? So and in particular, it's very important to say that for the poorest households in the country, food is not cheap. Food is expensive, represents 17 to 20% of their household income, and yet they're spending less than £40 a week on food. So, it's a small amount by comparison with the average household, and certainly by comparison with richer households. But it is a high proportion of people's income in the poorest households in the country. And so there is a pressure to ensure that those households can eat. They can eat decent food. They can eat affordably, and they can eat well. And that pressure, I mean, I think that the problem with that perspective is it's been misused. It's been used as a kind of weapon to say that's why we have to bring prices down. That's why the supply chains work like they do. That's why supermarkets are continually squeezing farmers so that they can get food as cheaply as possible onto the tables of the poorest people in the household, because in the country. But there's another aspect of cheap food which is actually, it turns the whole thing on its head, which is that the hidden costs of cheap food are enormous, and they represent health costs from poor diets. They represent health costs from inadequate nutrition. They represent social costs from being out of work because you're on chronic disease, because you've eaten so badly for a very long time. And they represent the poorer quality of life of having, if you like, what I like to call engineered calories. Really, that idea that cheapness is the destination of our food tends to lead us towards a food system which basically tries to push calories through the system as cheaply as possible, and neglects the fact that it's racking up these enormous costs in health, in social care, in lost productivity in the economy, and in lost quality of life. And those costs are not inconsiderable. So the piece of work that I did for Food Farming Countryside Commission at the end of last year worked out that in a year last year, in an average year, the cost was £268 billion. The health related, social care related, lost productivity related costs of eating that poor diet, that cheap food, are enormous. They're three times the actual cost of the money that households as a whole spend on food. So, yeah, it's cheap in one measure. It's
Yeah.
still difficult for poor households to afford it, and yet it's very, very expensive to society.
That 268 billion figure is a year is genuinely staggering. I mean, how did you get to that figure? What does that actually mean? Is that in terms of a cost of the health service? Is it loss of workforce productivity? Is it a combination of all those
Yeah,
things?
it's all of those things. I it's a sort of number crunching exercise, and in the nature of a number crunching exercise like that is to make assumptions as best you can that are conservative and robust. And so I looked in particular at the burden of chronic disease, because chronic disease is very much diet related. So, and I spoke to experts about that, and I got a kind of estimate of how much preventable chronic disease is coming through the food system. And that's the biggest tranche of that. It's over 100 billion pounds a year. And the other thing I did in the report, which to speak to Emily's points about the quality of food coming through the farming chain and through the food system as a whole, and ensuring that that quality is maintained. I did a little bit of a back of the envelope calculation on what that might cost, and that was, let me just have a look at the numbers here. That was It's 57 billion in addition to the existing cost. So if we wanted everyone in the household to eat a healthy diet, what would that cost? It would cost about 57 billion, which is just over half again of what people are currently spending. So people currently spend around about 100 billion on food.
Mm.
With another 57 billion, that could be a really healthy diet. That 57 billion looks like it's kind of hard thing to find, particularly for the poorest households in the world. But it's a quarter of the additional costs that we're racking up in the economy because we're feeding people cheap engineered calories that are making them sick.
Yeah.
And that I think is that's a point I think Treasury should be taking seriously because we can't afford that burden of cheap, careless calories being plummeted through the system, pushed through the system continually, and the absence of decent food for the poorest, absence of decent food actually even for the richest
Mm.
sometimes, because our diets are not perhaps what they should be to improve our health, and racking up unpayable costs for the health service, for the social care service, for the economy as a whole, and imposing this burden of poor life quality because people are not eating decent food often enough.
Yeah. Emily, at the Oxford Farming Conference in January, we heard from food poverty campaigner Dominic Watters, and he talked very powerfully about what life was like on his estate. I think it was a bit of a eye opener, I guess, for a lot of the farmers in the audience. I mean, I like to think I'm relatively well informed on these things, but it was for me even. And he talked about how the people on his estate, not only do they not have transport to get to. There's one shop on the estate, and that's nearly stocked high with ultra processed food. They don't have a Most people don't have cars. There's no access to public transport. Most people don't own a freezer or an oven, and yet as farmers, and I guess you can talk about the class of middle class kind of, we all just sort of throw this phrase around cheap food. Why don't people pay more for their food? And I don't know. When you hear from Dominic, it really brought home what a struggle it is for a lot of people in this country, didn't it?
I Yeah, and the problem is, and I completely agree. I mean, Dominic is an unbelievably powerful advocate. Um, can you hear that?
It's a little bit
I've got
little bit crackly, but
I've got plumbers. Sorry. Um,
right.
I completely agree with you, Will. Dominic Waters is an unbelievable, powerful advocate for. Hang on a minute. I might just have to stop because it's just annoying me more than anything. Hang on.
Don't worry. The joys of Zoom recordings.
Was that okay? Well, I wasn't sure how much you wanted to get into the weeds on the numbers and stuff, but I think um,
No, brilliant. I think when you hear those numbers, it just it's eye watering, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah.
Been
No,
we've
no,
been
really good.
waiting Sorry, we've been waiting for 3 weeks for the plumbers to get here, and they've finally turned up today and are fixing the ensuite toilet that's just by the office. So the irony of it being in the middle of a podcast recording is not lost on me or anyone
Don't
else.
worry.
Anyway,
Don't worry.
Dominic Waters is an unbelievably powerful advocate, and yet the story that he told and kind of how that helps us see this dilemma from somebody else's perspective, I think it's really important. That's what the Oxford Farming Conference does so well, right? It's open our eyes to this alternative view, and sort of coming back to the theme of this whole podcast. That's why it's really really powerful. I think the challenge is really that farmers kind of get thrown a little bit under the bus as the cause of the problem. So, the way that this is showing up at farm level in externalities, in pollution, for example, or sort of the fabric of agriculture being underinvested, so we can't do everything. What's leaking out of the system. Um, Whereas farmers are as much, a victim of this system as consumers are. But I think what I find so interesting in kind of having these different perspectives is how we kind of come back to this enormous problem. It's this huge problem of the consumer society that's been designed as a political choice, and how you then kind of move forward from where we are now to make really sensible decisions that don't kind of like kick the symptom, or are dealing with these sort of small They're not small, they're big. Dealing with the symptomatic issues rather than dealing with the structural core issues. And I think that's part of the problem here. We're arguing about these different um, issues that are a symptom of this much bigger problem that we're all absolutely invested in.
Yeah. Does that the downward pressure on farm gate prices, Emily, and I guess some, as with farming at all times, some sectors are doing well and some not so well. So at the moment, arable farmer, if we use that as an example, wheat and barley price very, very low at the moment. Does that downward pressure affect how people farm and what they grow?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a classic kind of corn versus horn, Will.
Yeah.
And as I grew up in a very mixed farming system, that was the entire point of the mixed farming system, was that when some things are up, some things are down. That's the core of good business practice, is not to have all of your eggs in one basket. I think the pressures for some farmers has been because they've been encouraged or forced or kind of nudged towards specialization, and specialization that leads to intensification. It's kind of then exposed a lack of resilience within some of those systems, particularly when you layer in some of the external pressures around climate change, for example, and just dealing with weather patterns that kind of put even more pressure on the system. So I think we constantly have to be kind of like working out, like, what does resilient farming look like that also enables these kind of broader issues to be taken into account, in particular access to healthy, affordable food. So what are we really growing on our farms, and how are consumers able to access that food in a way that brings health to everybody? And that's the conundrum we're trying to solve.
Yeah. And you mentioned climate change, and I guess this might be one for another episode, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. I'm just trying to, well, I've just written something about 1976. So if you grow up in farming in our generation, you always hear your parents talk about 1976. My dad sort of talks about it all the time. And in that year, because of as a directly a result of the prolonged drought, food prices went up by 12%. And we know that sort of 9 out of 10 of the hottest years ever recorded have occurred since 1990. We know temperatures are rising. Are we prepared for this, Tim, and the effect that might have on food prices and the supply chain?
The answer to that is undoubtedly no. I just want to come back to a couple of the points that Emily was talking about, because I think they're really important. Um, the first, I think, is this, and I was shocked by this when I first. It was one of the first phase of the Food Farming Countryside Commission. We did this bike tour, which was going
Yeah.
around talking to people all over the country about the food system and about farming and about countryside. Brilliant idea, and Sue Pritchard's idea. And the one there was one story in that absolutely shocked me, of people in the food system, working in the food chain, who could not afford food, and in order to eat, they had to go to the food bank. Now that is a dysfunctional system. That is a dysfunctional food system where the people who are creating the food cannot afford to eat the creation of their own labor. They cannot
Mm.
afford the fruits of their own labor, and they end up going to a food bank. And that really struck me, that this is a system issue. This is an issue. To some extent, the call for cheap food is a weapon. It's a weapon of a dysfunctional system, when the problems are the lack of affordability and the huge inequality in society on the one hand, the flooding of the food market with cheap engineered calories on the other hand, that's making us sick. And on the kind of third axis of this is a farming system that, if it wants to produce decent food, has to be resourced properly, and it has to be paid properly for the fruits of its labor. So this is not a, can we bring food prices down by massive productivity, or people should stop complaining about the expense of food because it's actually very cheap, or they should stop complaining about the cheapness of food because actually it's very expensive. It's not about that. It has to have a systematic overview. It has to have someone somewhere saying this system is dysfunctional. This food system is dysfunctional. It's dysfunctional for farmers. It's dysfunctional for consumers. It's dysfunctional for the government because it's picking up the huge social costs associated with bad food and bad diet. It's dysfunctional almost everywhere you look. And the problem with something that looks dysfunctional wherever you look at it, it means you're probably not looking far enough. You're not probably looking hard enough. You're not probably looking for the people for whom this works very well. Who can increasingly turn a profit from a dysfunctional situation. And if you think a bit, look at it in that way, then, you can sort of see why. You can see two things. First of all, that there is a set of people there who are profiting from a dysfunctional system, particularly the engineered foods, the ultra processed foods, the engineered calories that is kind of pumping its way into the diet. You can also see how they profit not only from the illness the sickness that system creates, but also from all of these arguments about the cheapness of food, because it plays into their favor if they can drive down the costs of engineered calories through a whole bunch of mechanisms that's actually distorting the market for real food. Then they can run away with the profits of that system. And that's exactly what's happening. We need to call that out. We have to call out that there is a set of actors within this dysfunctional system that is benefiting shareholders, those who've received dividends from companies that are creating foods that are not really foods that are making people sick. And on the back of that, they're imposing huge social costs on society and huge social costs on the farming system itself. So to get away from this dialogue about, the cheapness of food, we actually have to start talking about real food. What is actually food? And that's the stuff that farmers do. That's what the process is. That's what where real food comes from. And most people often don't really think very much back beyond the supermarket shelves to the food supply chain that gets there. And therefore, they're easy prey to an argument that says, well, you want your food as cheap as possible, don't you? Of course you do. And you can't even afford what you're eating at the moment. So we need to make it even cheaper. And so the best way to do that is to flood the market with more cheap engineered calories. No, it's a recipe for disaster.
Emily, have you got any thoughts on that, on who the beneficiaries of this cheap food economy are?
Yeah, I think Tim, totally respect what you're saying. I think the negative narrative is really like at the core of some of what's the issue here. Being told that it's broken, being told that you're bad, being told that this is all a disaster, just switches people off, and I think also gets people's backs up who were already under pressure from lots of other different directions. Sort of the switch from having something convenient to having something complicated that you need to prepare and cook, like puts a social burden on people who at the moment are time pressured, and not necessarily have all the resources in order to be able to do those activities. So we have to be incredibly careful to meet consumers and farmers where they are in landing some of these bigger messages about systemic change. So as much as what Tim's pointing to, I can't deny the evidence is there, the health burden is there, all of that kind of thing. Like how we actually take people on this journey towards this better future that sort of acknowledges that change is going to be incremental and driven. So what can government do to kind of like put those targets in that kind of turn this super tanker in a better direction? Starting from a point of sort of from a point of negativity, I think switches people off.
Let me push back a little bit. There is a point at which you have to say something is broken. There is a point, and if you're not saying it's broken, then you basically end up in hock to the people who are profiting from it. That is not going to take us forwards. And an incremental approach to that is not going to take us forward. At a certain point, I think you actually have to call it out and say, no, there are people profiting from a broken system. Those are not the farmers on the whole. I'm absolutely with you on that. I'm absolutely in favor of a farming system that works, that is able to afford to produce the healthy food that actually is the basis for a healthy diet. That's what we're trying to get to. That's what we're trying to fix for sure. That's the goal. That's the outcome. Um, but we have to say where things are going wrong and why they're going wrong. And in a systematic sense, and I tend to think in terms of systems, that systematic sense is that we are allowing a narrative around cheap food to push and to legitimize an industry which is not producing even real food and that is making people sick. And that is having two bad impacts. One is it's having a negative impact on the nation's health. The other is having a negative impact on the food supply chain, which means on farmers. Unless you can see that, then you're not going to be able to fix either of those things. I do agree with you, totally. It's not a welcome message. Nobody likes to be told something's broken. And I certainly wouldn't say that to any farmer anywhere, although many farmers would probably see for themselves that they're not able to function and that it is a slightly broken system. And I totally take the point that we need that positive vision. So that, and that's kind. We don't just need positive vision though. We can all say that. Everyone should have the right to healthy, affordable food. Farming everywhere should be regenerative and respectful of nature. We can say those things, and the food strategy published yesterday said some of them. It had nothing in terms of policy. It had nowhere to go. It had no fixes for any of it. It hasn't got much in the way of measurable targets. It's probably not going far enough on key issues like health, but at least it's a start. So I went to ChatGPT and I asked it to do the same thing, to come up with 10 outcomes. It came up with 10 brilliant outcomes, drawn from the literature, drawn from the knowledge, drawn from what we know, what we already know about how the food system is broken. These are the outcomes we should aim for. And then I asked it, and it took about 5 nanoseconds, and then I asked it, could you come up with some policies? It took a little bit longer, but it didn't take as long as writing a food strategy that had no policy in it whatsoever. And that's my point, is that, unless we see that the system is broken, unless we see that this has to have intervention at a bigger level, unless we ask and demand our government to do something about that, we're going to get incremental change after incremental change, strategy after strategy, point after point that changes nothing.
So,
And well, I mean, just on that, I mean, I think it's brilliant, Tim. We are asking, who's we? Voters are not going to vote for more expensive food. Okay. And I sort of think this is the problem, like how these arguments are presented, how this kind of like narrative is taken into government to say these are the solutions, these are the points of intervention that we all agree on that can take this forward. And I think that's the bit in all of this, in all of these debates that kind of get polarized around these issues and around the language of the issue. The language of the issue gets the attention. It gets, this is broken, right? We all look at it because it's broken and it's a tragedy. Okay. But actually the solutions come from consensus. And the consensus comes from understanding other people's perspectives, understanding what this means to everybody, and then finding the language that enables and empowers our policymakers to have confidence that they can move forward into this space, taking people with them, right? Because they're thinking short term too. They're thinking about, is this going to get me re-elected?
Yes, I agree with that. I do agree with that. I guess for me, I mean, the point about ChatGPT is that it's a large language learning model and it therefore produces consensus. That's literally what it does. It produces the consensus of our understanding, and it does it in a matter of seconds or minutes, very, very clearly. And then it hits that political process that you're talking about. Now, that political process is therefore not one which is producing consensus. It is incapable of producing consensus because the consensus is actually mostly already there. Now, yes, there are people that you have to bring along with you. So you certainly have to bring along households who cannot afford to eat. That's for sure. You have to bring along farmers because they are the people who are capable of producing the real food that will keep us healthy and allow us to eat in a way that is affordable, that is healthy, that is enjoyable, that satisfies our not just our evolutionary desire for sugar, salt, and saturated fat, but actually our gut biome and its need for nutrients and for fiber. All of that, which only the farming sector can do, that should not be difficult in the right sector. And then there are two other people that you have to bring along, two other sets of people. One is those interests, those people who already have a vested interest in the broken system. And the other is the politicians who have the power to make the changes. That and what you have to be really difficult, really careful about, and it is really difficult, is ensuring that when it comes to producing consensus, you are not being distorted by the dynamics of power, the dynamics of vested interest, the dynamics of the lobbying groups that persuade government that they have to produce a consensus out of this situation that actually is mostly dedicated towards satisfying the people who already benefit from the dysfunctionality. That's broken politics. I agree with you on that, but I don't think it helps not to call it out at this point.
Mm. Okay. Politicians are always fearful about anything that might push up food prices. We know this. How do we therefore make a sensible case for change whilst also protecting people who are already struggling to eat well? Emily.
Well, I I think that I think that too often, particularly within farming, but more within food advocacy, we get caught in this sort of intellectual argument that looks at the entire system, looks at the complexity of the whole thing, and then ends up agreeing in its own sort of way that it's a huge problem and we need a huge solution. And I think the thing that we need to focus on is kind of the near term small things that actually, from a systems perspective, can really begin to drive better. So rather than trying to fix everything and it being a huge problem, let's cut the elephant up, right? To use whatever metaphor that is, and deal with it whilst acknowledging that fixing one bit of it is going to produce some sort of longer term benefit. So where are those easy wins? Where's the vision that dictates the decision making? But also then where's the legal framework that holds it to account? That's why targets on the environment are so powerful and targets on climate are so powerful, is because they're targets. If you don't have the equivalent target that says, this is what we mean when we say healthy food, or this is what we mean when we say food security, and this is how it plays out in decision making. So I would advocate for something core in the middle there that allows and guides future decision making on all of the other different bits and pieces. So keep it simple, but it's going to be really influential. And I think if we can focus on that rather than worrying about the entire nature of capitalism, then we begin to really make some progress.
And Tim, would you agree?
Yeah, um, I agree that, it's not, there's no point worrying about the entire nature of capitalism. There is a point in articulating those places where capitalism is leading us towards difficult situations. But in terms of where do we go? What do we do? I just want to iterate this because I think I was kind of blown away by it. The desirable outcomes, which mirrors the 10 bullet points in yesterday's food strategy from the government that ChatGPT came up with. One, improve public health through nutrition. Two, reduction in food insecurity. Three, environmentally regenerative agriculture. Four, lower greenhouse gas emissions. Five, thriving local and regional communities. Six, fair wages and safe working conditions. Seven, food waste minimization. Eight, sustainable diets as the norm. Nine, biodiversity protection and restoration. 10, transparent and accountable governance. And then, in response to that, and I say, look, come up with some policies, which the food strategy completely failed to do. Easy. Introduce a national healthy food guarantee, regulate HFSS, high fats, salt and sugar food marketing, particularly to children, reform school meals, align dietary guidelines which haven't been updated for too long, about 7, 8, maybe nearly 10 years, sustainable agriculture and land use, redirect subsidies to support nature-friendly farming, introduce a soil health monitoring and protection act, fair work and food resilience, enact minimum employment standards for particularly for food workers. It goes on that we do not it's not that we don't know how to fix this, but we are in the absence of a willing politics to do so. And if that's the issue, then we have to speak up and say so.
Just Tim, from a farming point of view, just to I was at Groundswell last week, and I know Emily was as well. And there's a lot of farmers there who would be hear you saying that and be punching the air. Yes, I'm with you, and we're trying, and we do. But for every farmer that was there, there's 49 others who aren't and who
Mm.
think there's nothing wrong with their farms, and as probably Emily alluded to earlier, would probably get their backs up a little bit here when you say because there's nothing wrong with what we do. how do you take those farmers with you on the journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way you have to find ways that those farmers who are with us on the journey can amplify the voices. But you also have to recognize that a lot of farmers, probably the bulk of farmers are just trying to make ends meet. They're
Mm,
just trying to get from one season
yeah.
to the next season without a huge loss and with a reasonable profit. That experience that you were talking about, the groundswell experience, is people who are a coalition of the willing who understand the issues, who are making the changes. They are at the forefront of the change that we want.
Mm,
Even there's a little Alexandra Rose Foundation producing healthy food vouchers for poor households. It's just such a wonderful example of what should be being done, and yet government is not doing it. And so the bringing of that bulk of the farmers along has to be about creating the conditions of trust between the farming community and government, recreating the conditions of trust after the inheritance tax issue. But it also has to be a profound recognition of the reality, the everyday reality of the economics of farming for ordinary farmers. And if you've got, slim pickings, if you've got the margins on the returns on your investment, on your capital are so slim that you can barely survive season to season, you will do whatever it takes to keep that model going. You won't be thinking about disruptive change. It's not
mm,
fair to ask farmers to be thinking about disruptive change. It's not a demand on farmers to do things differently. It's a demand on the government to create a situation in which farmers can do their job and do it properly.
yeah. Emily, will the new sustainable farming schemes, it's just been announced in Wales. I'm sort of relatively positive about it. The SFI in England obviously had its ups and downs over the last few years. Is that going to help with all this?
What Wales has done well is use that process to rebuild trust, and this is the
Mm,
trust that Tim's just been kind of
mm,
alluding to. It's been an incredibly engaged process from what I can see from where it was to where it is now.
mhm,
Um, you can say better than me how it's been received in Wales, but I mean, I look at it and think, gosh, it's done some really clever things, particularly I think around the social value payment to acknowledge that there are these benefits that good farming will produce that are uncosted, that are sort of within a public goods definition, as was sort of articulated being the thing that we should be thinking about. So I think it's admirable in its coherence. If I have any criticisms, it's that it doesn't um, yet open itself up to um, supply chain expectations and supply chain needs. So it's very government partnership with farming, but not necessarily farming partnering with its customers.
mm,
And I think partnering with our customers is really important because our customers are ultimately consumers, and we need to be making sure that we're as much aware of that as we are that relationship with government. So I see this should be more of a three-legged stool, whilst accepting that relationship with the marketplace is perhaps where that difficulty comes from. So um, in England, in comparison, we're probably now going to have too much exposure to the marketplace bit and possibly not enough from government. And certainly that trust issue on all sides is a concern there. But the sustainable farming scheme, from what I can see from the outside, um, seems to be a well thought through process to where it's got to now.
mm. Okay. All right then. We're going to wrap this up with one last question to you both. What's one thing you've read, watched, or listened to recently that you'd recommend to listeners who are interested in this topic? Tim, you can go first.
Yeah, I mean, I come back to the idea, what is food, and in particular, what is real food, because the food system that we have, for all the very best intentions of the farmers who are working it, is being undermined by something which is not real food. And my sort of hero on that is a guy called Robert Lustig. He was in London a couple of weeks ago for a conference at the College of Medicine and a strand in that conference called Food on Prescription. Ultimately, we've all heard we are what we eat. That's perhaps a little oversimplistic, but what is absolutely true is that our health depends on having a healthy diet. And so his book on that, Metabolical, is a fantastic primer for that relationship between food and health, and also a fantastic signpost towards what a healthy farming and food system has to look like.
Oh, I've written that down. I shall read it. Emily, what about you?
Um, for me, well, it was something I read before I got involved in the Oxford Farming Conference, and um, it's a book called The Taste of Empire by Lizzie Collingham, which it just, I mean, when we see this thing in front of us and we call it the food system and we identify the successes and the issues it needs to improve on at the moment, you sort of think, oh, how did that happen? um, it is a good product of our choices. We're all a product of our choices, and actually, what Lizzie does in that book is kind of like set out how kind of the English attitude in the development of having a navy, of wanting to have naval dominance, right, meant that we needed to invent a processed food industry because we needed to feed these people on boats at sea. So it's sort of like all of these interesting little kind of, nuggets from history as to where this stuff came from. And then this global footprint and how we then adopt and bring in and welcome all of these different diverse tastes and this fascination for absorbing the flavors of the planet into what we call British cuisine. And maybe I would, accuse the English of having a slightly different perspective, cultural perspective on this than some of the food identity that's stronger in the devolved administrations. But it's just this fascinating kind of piece of how a globally looking country, rightly or wrongly, acquires this food system that's reflective of that development as a society. And I think that's why, like, the next dot in this journey, looking backwards, you've got all of these dots that get us to where we are now. But the next dot in our journey on this needs to be one that goes, oh, yeah, and then we became this, and then we started going in this direction. Yeah. And I suppose this is what we're sort of saying, rather than going, oh my God, we did this thing. It's broken, right? What do we do with it? Going, okay, where's our next dot? Where's our next dot going to be in this journey of being a responsible island of people on a rock floating through space? Right, having that awareness. I just think Lizzie's book really just put some of that history in perspective for me in a way that I hadn't appreciated with my very poor state school upbringing. It didn't cover kind of classical economics or history or anything like that, right? So I thought it was just one of those books that really opened my eyes. That and Richard Walker's book, The Greengrocer,
Yeah.
on his journey with Iceland Foods to become a responsible retailer, like, in how that works out at retailer level as well. I thought that was a very interesting book.
Fantastic. A whole reading list for the listeners there. Thank you very much, both of you. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you for your time, and thank you very much for listening. Please do let us know if you've enjoyed this conversation, and we'll be back very soon with another episode of We Need to Talk About Farming. That was great, guys. Thank you very much. Really,
You're
really good
welcome.
Thanks,
discussion.
Will.
Really good. Look,
Thanks, Will.
we've just about stuck to time as well.
Yeah, sorry. Once I've argued, I feel so bad telling my plumbers to shut up. Literally, he just turned up and they've not been here for weeks. So I'm so pleased they're here, and at the same time, like, going, I'm so pleased you're here, but please be quiet.
Three weeks isn't a long wait for a plumber, though. That's quick.
Well, when you only have one functional toilet and shower in a large house, it's quite a long wait.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, top work, Tim. I'm sort of supportive of it all. Wearing sort of in industry hats. It's very, very conscious of that whole thing about how we take people with us on this and kind of
Yeah,
keep building that direction. So I
yeah.
hope that reflected well in the
It's good
in
to have a
kind
little
of
bit of
in
a head to head on it rather than kind of agreeing with each other the whole way. I think that's good.
vehemently agreeing.
100%.
Yeah,
Everything that he just said with bells on, right?
yeah, right.
Doesn't make for good
Great.
listening, but yeah.
Yeah, okay,
Um,
guys.
It was great.
all
All
right.
right. Thanks, Tim.
You'll let
Thanks,
us know when
Emily.
it goes
No,
out, will you?
Will do. Yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm sure
brilliant.
Ella will. Yeah, I'll do the edit. I'm sure she'll send it over to you to have a listen to before it goes out.
Yeah,
But
brilliant. Okay,
all right. Cheers,
cheers.
guys.
Bye.
take
Nice
care.
to see you both.
Bye.
Bye.